Welcome to the fourth recording in the series where I narrate to you the contents of the document Cape Exit, Why and How the Cape Will Leave South Africa. The last recording that I did was quite a marathon one, and I thank those that stayed the distance and listened to it in its entirety. It's very important that we learn the lessons that are taught in here and take note of them. It gives us a good idea of where we come from and basically where we are going, who we are and where we are going. Without any further ado, I'm going to start narrating to you Chapter 2. This one's not going to be as long as the last one, I promise, and you will not have to listen to my monotonous, boring voice for too long. But please, stick it out. This is one of the last in the education part of the document, and once we've finished with the education part, then we are going to go into the nitty-gritty of the economy of the region and so on, and why it is possible, why and how it is possible to secede. Enjoy. Part 1, Chapter 2, The Capelanders. Chapter Synopsis. Census statistics compiled by Statistics South Africa proves that the main characteristics of language, culture and religion of the people have remained unchanged for decades. It not only proves that Capelanders are the super majority in the Cape, but also serves as the basis for a definition of a Capelander. Language. Afrikaans remains the dominant language in the Cape, but not because the mother tongue of the ancient indigenous ethnic groups were suppressed in any way. Instead, the emergence of Afrikaans illustrated the evolutionary progress that took place after 1652. The tongues of people of many origins became part of a new language for a new nation, just as their collective genes were the building blocks for a new gene pool, both of which formed the very backbone of the broad community that emerged from the Cape melting pot, and still represents the majority of the old Cape's inhabitants. The evolutionary process actually benefited the Khoi. Their various dialects were uncomplicated but simultaneously complex, with several kinds of tongue clicks and inflections which could give one word at least two different meanings, which meant that they were very difficult to learn unless born to them, and the vocabularies lacked words for the outside world's innovations. The Kung dialects were even more difficult to acquire. Considering the population losses of the catastrophic 1713 smallpox epidemic, the Kung and Khoi dialects went into a gradual natural decline, a worldwide phenomenon, but did not, as happened so often elsewhere, die out altogether. The lingua franca that would eventually become Afrikaans provided them with the opportunity to connect with the outside world to which they had become connected by the arrival of the age of exploration. It was a process which took place all over the world. For example, the people of ancient England learned to speak Latin as a second language after the Roman conquest, followed by Anglo-Saxon dialects, and again followed by French after the arrival of William the Conqueror. But like the Anglo-Saxon dialects, those of the Kung and Khoi left a lasting footprint on the evolving new languages which are still in use by all shades of the spectrum in some rural areas. In addition, the old dialects are still spoken to some extent in areas beyond the Old Cape's borders, such as Namaland and southern Namibia. Before the 1990s, it was fashionable in left-wing circles to decry Afrikaans as the language of the oppressor. This was far removed from the truth, as the facts show that it was not pressed on the people by the powers that were. It would be more accurate to say that it spontaneously imposed itself on Cape society, because it was a language which was initiated by the people for the people and eventually developed into an internationally recognized modern language. Politics. Before 1994, the Cape Province's boundaries were more or less those of the VOC Batavian days. The Atlantic coast in the west, the Orange River in the north, and the Great Fish River in the east. The Codesa negotiations resulted in this long-established entity splitting into three new provinces, the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, and the Eastern Cape. The division was purely a political strategy, favored by both the National Party and the African National Congress as an opportunity to increase their electoral advantages. The National Party persuaded itself, despite the clear indications to the contrary, that it would be able to capture the Northern Cape in the projected national election. On the other hand, the ANC believed it would take the Northern Cape by appealing to the black and some of the coloured voters in the new province's area, thereby further reducing the importance of the Western Cape, the only province in which it was unlikely to gain a majority. The result was unsatisfactory on all counts. The Western Cape lost a huge swathe of its traditional territory between the new northern boundary and the Orange River, creating an unwieldy administrative area with a weak tax base and a provincial capital, which was Kimberley, unsuitably located to the far east. The ANC won the northern province, saddling the country with a vast but scarcely populated area with a weak tax base that left it with few prospects for natural domestic development. But all this manoeuvring did not change one simple basic fact. As one glance at any language map of South Africa shows, Afrikaans is the primary language not only in the Western Cape, but also in large parts of the Northern Cape and the westernmost section of the Eastern Cape, in places to the point of virtual exclusion of other languages. As a result of this unjustified amputation, the rightful heartland of the true Capelanders was reduced by a great margin. This left the Western Cape as a small minority area, vulnerable to any draconic dictates that might be proclaimed by the overall black majority, who are seated mainly in the northern, northeastern, and eastern parts of the country. This is no mere hypothesis. The ANC has made no bones about the fact that it envisages changes to the provincial boundaries aimed at carving off further portions of the Western Cape, regardless of the fact that it would probably destroy or cripple the vibrant heritage that has played such a large part in making the Western Cape, with its free market economy, the only truly successful province in South Africa. The truth of the matter is that the Western Cape's success derives partly from clean government and long-term planning, but above all from an electorate whose members, unlike those of the other provinces, tend to vote according to their certitude and not their tribes or the color of their skins. They also tend to determine their representatives according to those convictions rather than dictates of a distant central authority. This is in direct opposition to the ANC with its mania for centralization, to the point that its head office even appoints the mayors of towns under its control, whether this accords with the wishes of the electorate or not. Religion. The population of the Cape is predominantly adherent to the various Christian churches. The map at the end of this section indicates the percentage of people who are indicated they are purely Protestant Christian, without any traditional black non-Christian beliefs. The only significant exception to this rule in the Western Cape is the Cape Malays, who are overwhelmingly followers of Islam, but are full participants in the societal mainstream. Yet another indication of the success of the Cape melting pot. This goes back to the days of the VOC, which did not accord equal status to Islam, but condoned the private observance of its adherents. As a result, no mosques could be built, but instead a network of private prayer rooms were established, one of which functions to this day. This was surprisingly tolerant for that day and age. It must be remembered that during the 17th century, Western Europe was threatened by a mass invasion of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. As late as 1683, 32 years after van Riebeeck landed at the Cape, the Austro-Hungarian capital of Vienna was besieged by a huge Turkish force of about 175,000 men, and it took over 2 months of bloody siege wars before the European forces managed to deter them. By regulation, the VOC administration at the Cape was empowered to invoke severe penalties on any active adherents of Islam, but this was not applied at any stage, and the Malay population could grow and flourish. In 1802, when the British accompanying force handed the administration over to the Batavian Republic, the new rulers immediately set about abolishing slavery, which was forbidden by the Republic's constitution and giving Islam the same legal recognition as the Christian churches. This was no mere lip service. The governor, General Jan Willem Janssens, proved that by regularizing the status of the oldest Muslim cemetery, the Tanah Baru, and granting the Muslim community a plot of land on which to erect its first proper mosque, more than 2 centuries later, the fact that Cape Muslims can be both full-fledged Capelanders while still retaining their religious and social identity is proof of how the melting pot approach can work if sincerely applied. Politics. Cape residents are not knee-jerk voters, like the inhabitants of the other parts of South Africa. Like citizens of any true democracy, they support, sometimes very heartedly, any of a variety of political parties. The principle of merit, which is largely ignored elsewhere in the country, is alive and well in the Old Cape, so that no party is safe in the seats of power at any level of government if it does not do its job properly. The results of the 2014 general election speaks for itself. In the 2014 election, an overwhelming 60% voted for the Democratic Alliance, which had a track record of good governance. Then, in the 2016 elections, Its share of the overall vote grew to 63.5%. The figures in both cases proved that Cape Townians were not hidebound but voters across social, racial barriers whenever they felt like it. If this trend were to continue, as it is indeed possible, the ANC is not likely to ever have a victory in the Western Cape, and the fact that the Economic Freedom Front, the most vociferous and radically race-conscious party, achieved only 2.8%, far below its averages in other provinces, indicates its lack of appeal in the Western Cape. It is also interesting to note that those parts of the Old Cape that have been corralled into the Northern and Eastern Cape also voted predominantly in favour of the DA. In other words, the Cape Nation provided further proof of its true spread. This is not to say that the DA has a chokehold on the Western Cape electorate. Thus far, the DA has scored significantly because it has built up a good track record of civic achievement and given the lie to the ANC, oft repeated, accused that the DA is a white party. But in an independent Cape, it would have to take its chances at the ballot box, just like any other contesting parties. If there are any remaining doubts about the political orientation of the rest of South Africa, one glance at the appropriate maps, Figure 3 and Figure 5, which I will have on the screen now, tells one how closely the election results match the true extent of the Cape Nation in terms of the ethnic and language spreads. In contrast, the rest of South African electorate voted overwhelmingly for the ANC, with the minor exception of Gauteng, where the DA is basically in similar opposition as to the ANC in the Western Cape. Definitions. Based on what we have learned thus far, it is possible to draw up two tentative formulations for the definition of a Capelander. Number 1. A descendant of either one or more of the following groups. A. The region's First Nations, that's the Khoi or the San, excluding any person who is a member of any predominantly Bantu tribe, example the Xhosa. B. Slaves and other indentured persons who arrived in the region before the 18th of January 1806, the date Britain colonized the Cape. And C. European settlers who arrived before May the 10th, 1994. Number 2. Any person and or descendants of persons who legally and permanently resided in the Cape Territory before May the 10th, 1994. The difference here is that there are no restrictions as regards members of any permanently settled ethno-cultural groups, which means, inter alia, that the provisions of Definition 1 above would not apply to members of the relatively small number of Bantu who have been living and working in the Cape for an appropriate length of time, to be determined, or their descendants. And that concludes Chapter 2.